Hello, I'm Julian Whittle from Cumbria Chamber of Commerce, and I'm here with Rachael Stephenson, a Senior Associate at Burnetts Solicitors, who heads up the firm's wills, probate and trust team. Rachael, most people realise that it's sensible and prudent to make a will, but I've seen statistics that only 3 in 10 actually have one. Why is that, do you think?
Well, Julian, almost every day people come into my office saying, I've been meaning to make a will for years. Unfortunately, as you say, 70% of the population die before they get round to it. And I suppose all I can just say is that it's possibly a sobering and rather sombering subject, and on that basis, people try to ignore it for as long as they can.
It's even more important to have a will if you're in business, isn't it?
Yes, Julian, it's fundamentally important for all business owners to make a will. Doing so ensures that the interest or shares in the business will pass to the right people at the right time, and that executors are in place to deal with decisions including, for example, how the business should be run during the period of the estate administration. I suppose also the wills can be used to protect assets for the beneficiaries if they go through a divorce or bankruptcy, and that can often have a very negative effect on family businesses.
So what happens to your assets if you die without making a will?
In England and Wales, there's a statutory set of rules known as the intestacy rules. These define how your estate should be dealt with in your will if you die without leaving a will. These rules were originally drawn up in 1925 and have been infrequently updated since then. So to be fair, they don't really reflect the social, economic or political changes that have necessarily happened over the last almost 100 years.
So what do the intestacy rules say?
The rules of intestacy determine who should administer your estate and who should benefit from it. In practice, the rules are often quite harshly applied as they don't really allow for modern family relationships. For example, where there are children of whatever age, your spouse is only guaranteed a limited share of your estate, with the rest of your estate having to pass to your children.
Oh, right.
It does depend on the size of the estate, but it can therefore lead to a situation where, for example, the spouse gets only part of the estate but is still responsible for meeting the ongoing financial needs of children and young family. In the modern day we live in, divorce is common. The intestacy rules do not necessarily provide for a fair disposition of assets on the death of a second marriage. But really most fundamentally is that there's a large failure in the legislation to provide for cohabitees, irrespective of how long people have lived together. In this world nowadays, it's not uncommon to have what we would deem the common law wife.
Yeah.
The farmer who lived with his partner forever, she took his name but they never actually married. But that could mean that they're not automatically entitled to a penny should your partner decease. They would then have to make a claim against your estate going through the courts, which is expensive and would be absolutely heartbreaking in what was honestly just a simple mistake.
So from the point of view of a business owner, what could go wrong in this scenario?
When I'm estate planning for a person with a family business, I give very careful thought to how we maintain a balance between the family members and the continuing running of the business, both of which are equally important in that position. The rules of intestacy don't afford any opportunity for that consideration to take place. Therefore, for example, if a business owner dies without leaving a will, it might be the case that the whole of their estate would pass to a surviving spouse or child who has no involvement with the business. This could put the surviving business owners in a difficult position, as perhaps they might not have even been afforded the option to purchase the share of the business that the deceased person had. When we consider making wills, the business constitutional documents should be reviewed to ensure that the will and the documents work together to provide a solution for all concerned should the worst happen.
Okay. Now, if the business is a partnership, or if the person making the will doesn't own the business outright, perhaps they're a shareholder, does this present any particular issues?
Yeah, it presents various issues, and I think I would just stress in this situation that each matter should be considered on its facts and with all the relevant documentation to make sure that continuity can be maintained should the worst happen to any business owner.
Can the way that a will is worded reduce a potential inheritance tax bill?
Every estate on death is potentially chargeable to inheritance tax, so it is extremely important that planning is undertaken to ensure that all assets in an estate qualify for exemptions and reliefs. Business assets may qualify for business property relief, which can reduce the estate's liability to tax by up to 100%. There are specific criteria which must be met, and wills should be prepared accordingly. Similarly, when the estate of a deceased is administered, we should also give thought to how to maximise tax reliefs for a future spouse in the future. Julian, if it's all right, I thought I might give you an example of a case where this was recently quite applicable.
Yeah, definitely.
I recently dealt with an estate where a gentleman had passed, leaving the whole of his estate to his wife. This included substantial business assets. The wife had been both financially independent and also physically and mentally capable throughout her husband's lifetime, and on her death didn't want anything to have to do with the business. Instead, she wanted to move down to Derbyshire to live near her daughter. If this lady had taken the business assets that were due to her under her husband's will, and she would have wanted to sell them, if she'd sold the assets, there would have been business property relief to pay on the sale proceeds on her death. Instead, we varied the estate or the will of husband to hold the assets, being the business, in trust for a period of time. The business was then sold, and the proceeds of sale continued to be held on the terms of the trust. This ensured that after the wife had died, which she actually very unfortunately recently did, we have the full inheritance tax relief applicable on the business proceeds. Okay.
So explain, what is a discretionary trust and what is its purpose?
A discretionary trust is a very flexible form of trusts. It's a trust that allows trustees to have discretion as to how and when and for who some or all of the capital or income of the trust fund can be used for the benefit of a named class of beneficiaries. So in principle, it provides often a workable solution for a family situation where at the time of making a will, the testator is not necessarily certain as to who they would want to benefit from their estate.
I see, yeah.
Discretionary trusts, whilst also created under wills, can be created during your lifetime, but that's possibly beyond the scope of this podcast, but it's certainly worth mentioning. I often use discretionary trust in a situation where you might have a beneficiary or beneficiaries who you may deem as being slightly vulnerable, be it to financial instability, self-employed serial bankrupt, or people with perhaps an addiction or some third and exterior motive that they need to perhaps to be protected from. As well as being flexible, discretionary trusts also have the advantage of allowing trust assets to remain outside of the beneficiary's estates for inheritance tax purposes. So, for example, if you've got children where perhaps they are already financially self-sufficient and have perhaps estates themselves that would be subject to inheritance tax, rather than sort of skip a generation, as you like, giving everything to grandchildren, absolutely, perhaps put it on a shelf on a discretionary trust for the benefit of their parents and the grandchildren as it's appropriate to do so. The only thing I think to mention is that taxation of trusts is very different from the taxation of an individual, and the rules relating to it need particular specialist advice.
So is making a will a complex and expensive process?
Straightforward wills at Burnetts are prepared on a relatively straightforward fixed fee structure. Inevitably, more specialist work is charged at our hourly rate, and by the fee earner dealing with the matter, you should always be provided with a clear estimate of costs at the outset of a matter.
What issues should people think about before making a will?
I always ask that people give very careful consideration to the extent of their estate at the time that they're coming in. I always encourage people to be mindful of what they may have in the future, but often have a slight battle, if you like, with clients where they say, but I'm going to inherit this large sum in the future. And I say, well, that's all very well and good, but let's talk about what we actually have to deal with today. Then inevitably we should be thinking about, well, who would we willingly trust to manage the administration of our estates, be it friend, family, professional, executor or otherwise. If you have infant children, guardianship is a particularly important point to include in your wills, whether or not you wish to make any gifts, and I suppose your funeral wishes, if there's anything particularly that you would like to include.
Right. So, because it's not essential to use a solicitor, is it? I mean, anyone can draw up their will and get it signed by two witnesses, but what are the pitfalls of a DIY will?
Well, Julian, one day the legal profession will drag itself into the 21st century. There's a recent case that's just gone through the courts to suggest that a will that was made by way of text message should be deemed as valid. Whether or not we'll ever have that in the UK is a completely different matter. But for now, you're quite right. A will must be made in writing and on paper. Video recordings, computer images and the like are not acceptable. The will, as you say, must be signed and witnessed by two independent people.
But what are the pitfalls of doing it yourself then?
Well, I would say that you should see a solicitor and have your will drawn up properly. But you all know you can pop along to Smith's or the post office and buy a printed will form and you fill in the gaps. These forms, I'm not going to lie, are okay in the most straightforward of situations. For example, if you're leaving everything to an adult child who you know is bound to survive you. But otherwise they can be incredibly dangerous. Everyday words and phrases can have a completely different legal meaning to those that they were intended to have. You can end up paying a solicitor more to unravel a homemade will than it would have cost to have one probably drawn up in the first place. And certainly in a similar manner, an outdated will can be a very bad thing. A 20-year-old will can be worse than having no will at all if your family circumstances have changed, and of course the law changes significantly over time.
Okay.
So I suppose, to summarise, your will's not necessarily the most savoury matter to discuss with your partner over breakfast, but you should do it and you should keep it under regular review.
So once the will is written, what happens next? Who looks after it?
If you make a will with Burnetts, we would offer to log your will into our strong room here for safekeeping. We always suggest that it's not a good idea to have too many copies of your will floating around, but you can always have copies if you need them. We wouldn't charge for that service. Alternatively, you can pay your bank to store them for you in a bank storage vault, or I suppose you could have a safe at home. My concern is always when clients decide they want to keep their wills at home, but we would like to know that they're at home. We wonder who else they might tell and have access, and who might have access to their safes or strong rooms.
And as you were saying a few minutes ago, it's important to review and update the will once it's written, isn't it? Because I think there's a temptation, people think, right, I've made the will, job done, forget about it.
Yeah, I think here we have a system at this firm where we write to our clients every 5 years if we have not heard from them, to say to them, just pull your will out and check it and make sure that it still fits with your objectives. What I would say is that I also say to my clients to review their affairs on a personal basis very regularly, and certainly when there's certain life triggers such as having a child, moving house, perhaps if you're thinking about retirement or you suddenly become an quote empty nester, is a very regular time for review. But for it not to be an unsavoury and hidden subject, but rather something that's just a bit matter of fact and we should think about generally.
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel.